Today's speaker is Ann Gass. She's written the book Voting Down the Rows, Florence Brooks, Whitehouse, and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage. She traces Florence Brooks' life and activities, and you are the great-granddaughter of Florence Brooks. So, without further ado, I will introduce Ann, and this is a thank you for you.
Thank you very much.
So I don't forget to give it to you at the end.
I'll try not to lose it. Well, thanks so much for having me here today. So I would like to start with a poem that my great-grandmother wrote. I don't know exactly when she wrote it, but I found it in a newspaper account of a hearing in front of the legislature's Judiciary Committee in 1917, in February of 1917. And they were, all the suffragists and the anti-suffragists were up there to lobby for or against a statewide referendum for women's suffrage. And so this is what my great-grandmother had to say. She said, "I have no quarrel with you, but I stand for the clear right to hold my life my own, the clean, clear right, to mold it as I will, not as you will, with or apart from you, to make of it a thing of brain and blood, of tangible substance and of turbulent thought. No thin gray shadow of the life of man. Your love, perchance, may set a crown upon it, but I may crown myself in other ways, as you have done who are one flesh with me. I have no quarrel with you, but henceforth this you must know. The world is mine, as yours, the pulsing strength and passion and heart of it, the work I set my hand to, women's work, because I set my hand to it." So, I like to start with that poem because I think it captures the essence of who Florence Brooks Whitehouse was. She was a writer and a poet. She was certainly a suffragist, but she was also a peace activist. She had a fine soprano voice and was a member of the Rossini Club. She was an artist, an amateur artist, a painter, and she was very active in her community. She was a devoted wife and mother. So she was indeed a woman who set her hands to many things over her long life. And I didn't know anything about her until I was in my early 40s. I mean, my mother, she died when my mom was 15 years old, and my mom was born and grew up in Portland, and that's where Florence was living, so she certainly knew her, but somehow Florence just didn't convey this kind of history to them. And so she didn't really remember it. I knew she had been a suffragist. I knew she had written a couple novels, but that was about it. So it took me 15 years, in amongst the other things that I was doing myself, you know, raising my own family and running a business, to figure out this story. And I went to a lot of sources. My aunt actually found some papers that Florence had left behind at the farmhouse out in Raymond that the family still owns, the extended family. So those are the Maine Historical Society. Anybody can look at those. The Library of Congress has the National Women's Party papers, as well as the papers of Carrie Chapman Catt, the two national suffrage organizations. I looked at newspapers and I read extensively in Maine and suffrage in U.S. history. So it took me a long time to piece together the story. And when I came to realize that, because she was referenced a couple times in some of Maine's suffrage history, but always as a kind of a fringe kind of nutcase who was more trouble, you know, more of a rabble-rouser than she was an aid to the cause. And that simply wasn't true. That was why it kind of pissed me off, and I had to go write this book.
Good for you.
Yeah. So the reason was that the more conservative suffragists had written the histories back in the day, and that's what everybody remembered. So anyway, so you should be questioning the stories that come to you from your ancestors and look into them a little more. So here's Florence. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about her background, and then just kind of fast forward into suffrage. I think she was. I think her background really prepared her to be the effective suffrage organizer that she became. She was born in Augusta in October of 1869. and at 7 Spruce Street. And this is her father, Samuel Spencer Brooks, who owned a hardware store on Water Street in Augusta, and also sort of dabbled in shipbuildings. He had lots of business interests and managed to keep the family in substantial comfort. This is her mother, Mary Caroline was from the her maiden name was Wadsworth, so she was connected to the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow family, which may have sparked Florence's early interest in writing. You can see she has these kind of intense blue eyes, and whenever I think of her saying that poem to the Judiciary Committee, I just think of her kind of really standing there and looking at each man in turn, because of course it would have been all men then, and just saying, "The world is mine." And this is her younger sister. But there were 3 older brothers, so a family of 5 there. And this has nothing to do with anything except that her father was one of the early families, her family was one of the early ones to buy into what became a flourishing middle-class summer colony off of Boothbay Harbor on Squirrel Island. And so this is Squirrel, and she's in her early 20s, and this is her brother. It looks like he's abusing her, but really I think he's just twisting her chin around so she'll look at the camera. And this is her brother Percy, and she got along really well with him. And this is the man who becomes her husband, Robert Treat Whitehouse. And I don't know who these mutton chops person is here, but what a costume. Can you imagine having to wear that every day in the summer? Anyway, here they are, the happy couple. This is actually probably a little later in life, but Florence, she went to the public schools in Augusta, and then went to St. Catherine's Hall, which was, I think, a finishing school affiliated with the Episcopal Church. And then from there, she could have gone on to college. I'm certain her dad could have afforded it, but she was pretty independent, and she didn't want to go to college. She wanted to study art, specifically sort of painting and drawing. She wanted to study voice, and she wanted to study languages. And so she found herself some masters in Boston to go down and spent a couple winters there studying with these masters before launching off on a round-the-world trip. Well, mostly, actually, it was more like Europe and the Holy Lands. She spent about 18 months traveling over there. She spent an entire winter sailing up and down the Nile with the McCormick family, and Cyrus McCormick, their ancestor, had invented the Reaper, so they had quite a bit of money. Maybe that's how she was able to travel in comfort with them. I don't know how she hooked up with them, but the family myth is that her I guess he had been, had his eyes on her long before this, but Robert at Whitehouse heard that she was getting romanced by somebody else over in Egypt, and he sailed to Egypt and brought her home. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know for sure that if she hadn't been ready to marry him, she wouldn't have come home for him, because right from the beginning they had a very egalitarian relationship, which was quite different for that time. If she didn't want to marry him, she wouldn't have. And but they did marry in about 1894 and moved to Portland. His dad was the Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Court, and he was, I think, a year younger than her, but they'd pretty much been in school together. And his uncle also had a place on Squirrel. So they'd known each other quite a while. They bought a house at 42 Deering Street in Portland. And Robert had gone to Harvard. He became an attorney like his father. So he entered private practice initially, but and Florence started a writing group and joined the Rossini Club. But they collaborated on writing plays, and they would perform in the play, they'd direct the plays and perform in them for charity up and down the coast, in what is now Merrill Hall Auditorium, and all the way up to Boothbay and Rockport. So that was a lot of fun, but then the kids started coming along, as they do. And so here is my grandfather. He's the youngest. His name is Brooks, and he was born in 1904, and this is the eldest. That was William Penn, named after his grandfather, and Robert Treat Jr. So in the course of having these kids, she's actually also in the process of birthing books, and because Robert had said to her, "Why don't you turn the plays that we've written into novels? You're a great writer. I think that's a great thing to do." And so that's what she does. This is her first novel, The God of Things. And she produced these very fine illustrations for the book as well. And this was published by Little Brown Company and marketed from coast to coast. I still have her scrapbook of clippings, press clippings from this and her later book. So things are kind of going on swimmingly for this young family until 1908 when Brooks, my grandfather, comes down with polio. Which was, of course, was really quite a scourge in those days. And he was very ill. He was in an iron lung. And Florence just kind of dropped everything to take care of him. And of course, women in those days, they were the nurses, right? I mean, there wasn't really a visiting nurse association or anything like that you could call on. The women generally had to be the nurses. But she also, I think, really felt strongly that it was her responsibility to do that. And she really devoted herself to his care and making sure that he would live as active and sort of undisabled life as he possibly could. And later he did go to Harvard, and he could play tennis, he could hunt, and he attributed her, care administrations to his almost full recovery. So I think that story does show who she is. I mean, she was a person who, when her family and her community needed her, even as much as she believed in these other causes, she would turn to them and give them whatever help they needed. So here she is in 1913, roughly, which is when Brooks, he's the youngest, he's off at private school, and the two older boys are in college. So she has time now to start thinking about, what am I going to do now? And she has been involved in Maine's progressive movement, as has Robert, but she just starts thinking that that's just not enough. And one night she attends a lecture that's delivered by a woman who says, Mrs. Hamlin, whose thesis for the evening was that women should not have the right to vote. And Florence tried to sort of argue with her, but realized she didn't have the arguments in hand. So she finally said to her, look, I'm going to go off and read everything I can about suffrage, and then I'll come back in 6 months and we'll have a debate, and then we'll see. And so that's how she ended up getting involved in the suffrage movement. But you can see that already she had the sort of foundation to be a very effective organizer. She could write, she could think, she was comfortable on stage, she was very good at organizing her time, she had a supportive husband, and she was affluent enough so she didn't have to work. I mean, she was a prize candidate for an organizer, and she later said that she joined the movement and devoted herself completely to suffrage because I believe that the work I do for suffrage is 50 times more valuable to the community than 10 times the work on charities or any social work would be. Because charities, they didn't get at the root of all social ills. Low wages caused families to go hungry and forced women into prostitution. Lack of prohibition nationally, Maine had it then, but meant that men often would drink their wages instead of supporting their families with it. And she says, when women do vote, they won't be satisfied to skim the top of the pool of social corruption any longer, but they will pave it with clean cobblestones and put a drain through it and connect the source with a bubbling spring. Women are the conservers of the race and men are the consumers. Whoa, so that was in the newspapers. And but that's, that was really her. So she was much more willing to be vocal and kind of in your face a little bit more than most of the other suffrage workers in Maine were at that time. So here's she joins first the Maine Women's Suffrage Association, and for reasons peculiar to their time, they always refer to it as women's suffrage and not women's suffrage. But and the Maine Women's Suffrage Association was an affiliate of this national group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was kind of the legacy suffrage organization. It was a creaky old battleship of an organization, had tens of thousands of members nationwide. They favored a state-by-state approach to winning suffrage. In our country, there's always this sort of battle between states' rights and federal rights. And for a lot of reasons, it just had seemed easier to try to get suffrage at the state level. And by this time, there are 12 or 13 states that have where women have won the right to vote. They're all west of the Mississippi, though. The East is this conservative bloc, and it's been really hard to get suffrage approved out here. So here are the, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw was president when she first joined, and then Cherry Chapman Chatt became president at the end of 1915 and carried through until suffrage was won. And so here's Dr. Anna Howard Shaw. I'll just note that nationally, 96% of all public statues are of men. And I've gone into classrooms and schools to do talks and seen not one photograph or picture of a famous woman on the walls. So when I get a chance to show pictures of women, I do, even though I'm not going to talk about them too much. This is Carrie Chapman Catt. So Florence joins the Maine Women's Suffrage Association. They're desperate for younger volunteers because their leaders have been in the movement for a long time, and they're getting old, and they need younger people to come up and carry it through to the end. And so she has a suffrage column in the Lewiston Journal. She's their go-to debater. She writes articles, she writes letters to the editor. She does a ton of organizing, and she becomes the chair of their legislative committee, and is very effective at sort of polling the legislature and working with legislators around suffrage issues and getting hearings and that kind of thing. So that all goes well for a while, and but then in 1913, Alice Paul and her companion Lucy Burns formed something they call the Congressional Union, because they've been active in the suffrage movement in England. They're both Americans, but they were studying abroad and then became active in the suffrage movement over in England, where it was much more activist and radical at that time. I mean, they would have these big protests in front of Parliament. They broke windows. They set mailboxes on fire, and they were much more confrontational. And so Alice and Lucy were very involved with that. They got arrested. They both were imprisoned, and they'd gone on hunger strikes and been force-fed. And those kinds of tactics had never been used in the U.S. in the suffrage movement. But they kind of bring that experience back to the U.S., and they form the Congressional Union to focus exclusively on the federal amendment. And they're going to use controversial methods like picketing the president at the Whitehouse gates, which had never been done before, and holding the political party in power accountable for not moving the suffrage amendment through Congress. Now, the suffrage amendment had been introduced in Congress for many years, but it would die in committee. I mean, they almost never had a debate on it. It just didn't go anywhere. But now there are 4 million women in those dozen or so Western states who, if they could get them to vote in a block or as a block, could determine the outcome of the presidential election. The Democrats are in charge because Wilson is the president, and he's a Democrat, and then both houses of Congress have the Democrats are in charge. So they're going to try and rally those 4 million Western women to vote against the Democrats. Tell them, we don't care who you vote for, just vote against the Democrats. They tried that in 1914 and again in 1916 when Wilson is up for re-election. But they want suffrage now, and they're not willing to sort of pussyfoot around the way that NASA had been. So they come knocking at Florence's door in 1915 in the summer, because they're looking to set up state associations that'll put pressure on their congressional delegations to move this federal amendment through Congress. And they asked Florence to be the chair of the new Maine branch of the Congressional Union, and she says yes. So instantly, you see this in the correspondence, the Maine Women's Suffrage Association leaders are kind of freaked out by that. They're just like, we need her, she's our best organizer, but she's gotten entangled up with this Alice Paul woman, and we don't know what's going to happen. But Florence just says to them, look, when I work on the federal stuff, I'll work with the Congressional Union, and when I work on the state stuff, I'll work with you guys. It'll be fine, trust me. And it sort of was, and they had this uneasy truce for a while, but then in 1916, Alice Paul hires, there's Alice Paul, yep, and there's Lucy Burns. You can see, you can contrast them to Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. I mean, which one of these sets of women would be more likely to use a social media strategy, for example? This is what they look like at this time. So they're just a younger group. Social movements see this happen always when they stretch out over time, that younger people come along and they have a different way of doing things, and that's kind of what you see happening here. So that's just a quick recap. But so in 1916, this is Florence's press photograph for the Congressional Union, and oh, I should say this, yeah, Robert, he's very supportive of her suffrage activities, as was his father. His father was one of the founders of Maine's first ever statewide suffrage organization back in 1873. And in 1914, Robert starts the Men's Equal Suffrage League, because by this time, you know, the women really want to have the leadership of their own organization. They don't want men to be telling them how to run things, and so the men have their separate league, and his board was made up of all these sort of future you know, congressmen, future governors, future senators, up-and-coming men in Maine. And he's the chair. He remains chair from the beginning through suffrage being won. The one thing that he didn't like was the picketing, and he didn't want Florence to be arrested. So that ends up causing some marital friction, but they kind of work around it a little bit. She's never quite as active as she'd like to be, though, in deference to him because he has been so supportive. But, oh, I guess, yeah, I'll talk about this. You know, you hear this quite a bit in connection now with this, the suffrage centennial, is how racist the suffragists were. And, I mean, it's not wrong to say that, but it's also true that they were as racist as the rest of the country. Their racism really reflected the racism of the entire country. And this is a letter that one of Maine's senators has sent to Florence in 1915, and he says, you know, here he is, a Maine senator where, you know, there's probably like 500 blacks in Maine at this time, or, you know, not very many, and he says, I am not in favor of an amendment to the Constitution of the United States which would force women's suffrage upon states which don't desire it. And he kind of remembers back after the Civil War when the black men were enfranchised, and he says, the state of Mississippi has a white population of about the same size as Maine's, but also has about 1.2 million Negroes. And enfranchising the male population caused a big problem in Mississippi for those white voters. So, you know, he's not gonna support the federal amendment because of that. And so the conditions which prevail in them, I am sure, are not pleasing to any true American who believes in the freedom of the ballot and in equality under our Constitution and laws. So in effect, he's saying, you know, these Negroes are kind of a subhuman population who don't deserve to vote. And that's what the suffragists were dealing with. And they made a political and strategic decision to make the face of the movement white women, often younger women, and to not address the inequality and all the racism that existed in the country at the time, but just to go for the voting rights for women. And so it's fair to call them out on their racism, but it's also important to understand the context in which they were operating. So here we are in 1916, and Alice Paul hires Florence to go out to Wyoming, which of course came into the Union as an equal suffrage state, to campaign against the Democrats there in the 1916 election in the fall. And so she does go out there, but on the way out, she stops in Chicago, and here she is right there. She's holding this sign with this woman who's the head of the Illinois branch of the Congressional Union, Mrs. Workham Sippy. And their sign here says, why does Wilson seek votes from women when he opposes votes for women? And so Florence and Mississippi led this procession of women out of suffrage headquarters down the street to line up along this block. And this picture is only half of the lineup. There's a whole other half block of women all lined up here with signs. And they're there because Wilson is in town to give an important foreign policy speech. And so they're just waiting there for him with their signs. They're not saying anything. And then Wilson comes up, he gets out of his carriage or whatever, goes into the hall to speak. And as soon as he does that, all these men who are back here, you can see them, have lined up. They attack the women, and they grab the signs out of their hands, and they try to, destroy the signs. The women won't let go. They're thrown to the street, and it's just a chaos. And my dear, respectable middle-class women, which these all are, do not brawl in the streets of Chicago or anywhere else. And so it's just this huge melee. Florence goes over to this mounted policeman, because you can see she's not far from him, and she says, you know, what are you doing? They're attacking us. You should respond. And the policeman just laughs at her. And in the end, the mob chases the women back to their headquarters and then stands around outside for quite a while, just sort of haranguing them and saying nasty things. But that's exactly what the Congressional Union has wanted to see happen. They're trying to stir the pot, right? So they make sure that this is front page news in every newspaper they can get to all over the country, including back in Maine, by the way. So, and Florence writes about this event for her column in the Lewiston Journal. So after this, Florence goes off to Wyoming for a couple weeks, and she tours Wyoming. She has a blast. You know, she goes to Yellowstone, checks that out, and gives 2 speeches a day. And in the end, of course, you know, Wilson does get reelected. He campaigned under the slogan, he kept us out of suffrage, out of war, and the suffragists campaigned against him under the slogan, he kept us out of suffrage. And again, their message is, we don't care who you vote for, just vote against the Democrats. But a lot of women especially were very concerned about the war in Europe and really worried about the US entering that war. And so in the end, I think Wilson's message really won the day for him. So she goes back to Maine, and she's facing a problem because before she left for Wyoming, the Maine Women's Suffrage Association had decided, she had figured out, actually, as in her role as chair of the legislative committee, that they had the votes in the legislature for the first time to have a statewide suffrage referendum. They tried many times to do this. The legislature had always shut them down, but now they had the votes. And so the question is, should they go for it? Alice Paul said no, and it wasn't really her business, so she didn't really work on state suffrage referendums. But Carrie Chapman Catt actually attended that meeting and said, don't do it. You guys, you don't have the experience, you don't have a war chest, you don't have enough organizers, and we're really trying to concentrate our resources on those states where we think we can be successful. And but they're just so fired up, they can't say no, and they vote to go ahead with it. But when she gets back to Maine, her peers in the Maine Women's Suffrage Association tell her, you know what, we don't, you know, we heard about you, you know, brawling on the streets of Chicago, and you are way too radical for us. And if you're lucky, we'll let you lick stamps and address envelopes in this upcoming campaign, but you can't have a public role in it at all. And she's kind of like, well, I'm the one who's done the most of anybody around here getting this to this point, you know, this is crazy. So she's sitting home alone one night, sort of reflecting on this, and she hears a knock at the door, and she goes and opens it, and a bunch of her friends file in, and they tell her, well, we've just formed a new suffrage organization, the Suffrage Referendum League of Maine, and we made you president. Would you accept? And she said, gladly. So that's how she gets to work on the 1917 suffrage referendum, which the legislature does obligingly approve in February of 1917. So she's now sort of got this precarious membership in the Maine Women's Suffrage Association. She's the leader of the Congressional Union, and she's fronting this brand new organization whose board is made up of women and men, all of her friends in the progressive movement in Portland and beyond. It's sort of a blending, really, of the Congressional Union Board and the Men's Equal Suffrage League Board. So, so we have a problem, though. I mean, there's a few things that sort of wrinkle up, or throw a wrinkle in their organizing. So the referendum is approved in February, but then it's a really snowy winter, and then it's a long wet spring, and the rural roads especially, are this morass of mud. They can't get out and start really organizing until they clear up. And by that time, the U.S. has entered World War I. And instantly, all these women who said, I'm going to work full-time for suffrage, or I'll work half-time, or all my spare money is going to go into the suffrage referendum campaign. And instantly, as soon as the U.S. enters the war, they do this massive pivot to the war, and they're not available. They don't have any money. And so they're starved for money and volunteers, and especially the Suffrage Referendum League of Maine, because you know, that doesn't have the backing of any national organization, and so it's really hard for them to raise money. And Florence actually is one of the ones who does also pivot to supporting war work. And here she is in her Red Cross uniform. She became the head of the information bureau for the Red Cross in Portland. And at first it was just sort of doing promotional work around fundraising drives and things like that. But later in the war, it became the sort of entity through which the military could communicate to the families of servicemen and women abroad. So, you know, if you had a loved one who was injured or died in France, who would you talk to? There's no VA and there's no infrastructure, and so her committee became that entity. So she's pretty busy. It's not really until June that they start being able to work on suffrage, and by this time, the Suffrage Referendum League has offices at 662 Congress Street in Portland, and she really works hard during June and July and August to get things done. But there's another wrinkle, as if that the war isn't enough. I'll talk about this though for a minute. One of the things that they did was she had a friend who was an artist. He ran a mill in his day job, but in Wyndham. But he was also this amateur artist. His name was Frederick Freeman, but he did his artwork under the name Will Arcady. And so he did all these cartoons for them, and they would post them in the bay windows of their office on Congress Street and then have them published in the newspapers, especially the Daily Eastern Argus. And so here's a good example of them. The date for the referendum is September 10th, and the Grange and the Federation of Labor and Good Government are on the pro-suffrage side of things. Prejudice, vice, and the high cost of living are on the anti-suffrage side of things. So choose your side and everybody pull. Here's another one. It's a little bit hard to read this one, but I mean, he's using this opportunity kind of to challenge society's accepted images of how, what women's place is in the world. And so here it says 8,000 women, or 8 million women are earning their living outside the home in the United States. And President Wilson calls upon American women to mobilize for industry and agriculture to take the place of men who've gone off to war. And then Lloyd George in Great Britain says the Allies cannot win the war without women. And so here it says, this is an anti, kind of statement, women's place is in the home. So it's another junker for the scrap heap. And here's one other one that Frederick Freeman does of Florence. And you can see actually that this hat and this photo, this image is taken from that initial slide that I showed you. So he was quite talented. He put together, I think, a couple dozen of these over the course of several months. But here's the other problem. The other wrinkle is that Alice Paul in January of 1917 starts picketing the White House. And in those days, you actually could stand right next to the White House gates. And they did. Their headquarters was just a couple blocks away. They would come over from their headquarters. This is the first ever suffrage, banner picketing event that they did. And they walk over to the White House and they just stand there with their purple, white, and gold banners. And some of these, I think, do have some words on the background. But at first they're just silent pickets. They're not saying anything. They have signs that have words on them, but they're just challenging everybody who sees them, to think about women's suffrage. And at first, people respond to them with some sort of condescension and just kind of like, oh, those little women, those little ladies, they should just go back home and stop bothering the president. But as the U.S. enters the war, the patriotism just engulfs the country, and they're seen as treasonous, traitors to be challenging the president and putting up some awkward statements, sometimes quoting him, but also challenging him in different ways. Here's a quote. This is Alice Paul. The time has come to conquer or submit. For us, there is only one choice, and we have made it. So that's a direct quote from President Wilson, and they put it on their banner And they're just sort of, tweaking him to say, this applies to us too. We're not gonna take this line down. So off they go, and they start, by June, they're getting attacked, they're getting arrested and jailed. And things are really heating up. And every time that happens, again, they have this great distribution network. They're making sure it's front page news all over the country, and including Maine. So Florence is really not, they keep trying to get her to come down and picket with them, but she says, no, until this suffrage referendum campaign is over, I just can't. They're watching me. And every chance they got, both NASA, the national and the state Women's Suffrage Association would attack the pickets and just decry them, just say what a terrible thing it was that they were doing and how bad it was for women's suffrage. So even the people they should have been arm in arm with at this point are complaining about them. So she doesn't end up picketing. Here's another, this is a very controversial picket. It gets destroyed. They're comparing the sitting US president to the Kaiser, the German Kaiser. You cannot believe just how controversial that was. It made people so angry. This one, I don't think this one even made it out of their headquarters or very far. It didn't make it to the White House. The mob attacked them and destroyed it right away, and they kept, they had some extras. They kept bringing them out. So this one was very controversial. And they actually had been, this one came out in August, and just a few days beforehand, they had been in front of a congressional committee asking them not to sort of give the suffragists an exception to the Espionage Act, which Congress had approved a few months earlier, which really, this would qualify as being treasonous under the Espionage Act because they were criticizing the president. And so Congress never formally acts on that, but they only ever get arrested for obstructing the sidewalk. And so ultimately, the suffrage referendum goes down to a resounding defeat. It's defeated 2-1. And here is just a bit from a Portland paper where one of the U.S. congressmen from Maine says, the women, those pickets defeated the suffrage referendum in Maine. They have the highest motives, he said, but they really contributed to the defeat of suffrage. So of course, Florence is the most visible representative of the National Women's Party at this point, and so everybody's kind of really angry with her. She and Robert take off out of town for a while, and then they come back. They take a little break, oops, that's not. I missed a one. She comes back and she decides, you know what, I'm not going to work with those Maine Women's Suffrage Association people any longer. I'm just going to focus on the Congressional Union, which becomes the National Women's Party, and she stays active in that until suffrage is won. And she's really quite involved, despite still being involved in the war effort and some illnesses and things like that. But I want to read you another statement that this is a letter to the editor that she writes in 1918, before the war is over. And she says there's, one day she gets a request for help in a food drive from the local Red Cross, but then in the same mail she gets messages from the National Women's Party down in DC saying, women have been arrested for asking for suffrage, give publicity. And she says, in my heart there's a deep resentment against my country that at this time when it is demanding the greatest sacrifices from me and from hundreds of thousands of mothers the country over, that democratic principles be advanced in Europe, it refuses to recognize women in that democracy at home. A resentment that in all President Wilson's splendid oratory upon human liberty, there is no inclusion of women as human beings. That women who are responding with sons, money, and service to the government can be mobbed without protest, arrested and sentenced and placed in prison by the government which is taking their sons and their money and their service to wage its wars. The treatment of the Washington pickets will forever be a blight upon the United States government. Whether or not we believe their action is wise, there is no question, but they are within the law under the First Amendment of the Constitution. So she's the only woman that I found in Maine, at least in the Portland papers, the Lewiston Journal, and the KJ, who is being as vocal as this and really pushing back on this overriding sentiment that women should be, they should not be so vocal, they should not be picketing the White House, they should not be burning in an effigy, which they did down in DC. And it's a big problem for them. But Florence is the one who's continuing to respond to these appeals for help. And then finally, it gets through the federal amendment gets through the U.S. House in 1918. They just have to get it through the Senate. And they're short about 10 senators, and then they start working down the list, and they get down to 6, and then 4. They're so close. The pressure is enormous. And there's one senator from Maine, Frederick Hale, who they think is on the short list of senators that they can turn. But he had, in the 1917 referendum, told everybody that he would abide by the results of Maine's referendum. If Maine voted it down, he would vote against it in the Senate. If Maine supported it, he'd support it in the Senate. Well, it was a resounding defeat. So he's saying, no, I have to keep my word to the people. I'm not going to support this. So Florence, there's enormous pressure on Maine to turn him, and so they do letter writing campaigns. Florence, Alice Paul sends organizers to Maine. They have a huge mass meeting. They go and visit all the legislators to try to get them to send letters to Hale. They try all different kinds of ways, and in the end, he's kind of a weasel, and he holds out until the missing vote is found, and then he changes his vote from no to yes, so that he goes on record as having supported suffrage when his vote was superfluous when it might have been decisive. So that's why I say he was a weasel. But so Florence was very involved in. She was really the only, the major organizer in Maine on this, the only leader in that time period. Misa is given up on Hale and knitting socks and rolling bandages and raising money for French war orphans and things like that. They're just not involved at all. So eventually it does get through the Senate, and in June of 1919. So this is a telegram that Florence sends to Alice Paul, and she says, "Congratulations and rejoicing. Suffrage victory is due to you and your undaunted faith, splendid vision, and untiring devotion to the cause. And proud to be the lowliest of your disciples." So she's had involvement with both suffrage organizations. It's clear to her who really won the day for this. And but as we like to say these days, it was hard won, not done, because they're not done yet. They have to get it ratified. 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. It's a lot of work. They finally get it done in May. In Maine, it's November of 1919. So actually, this coming Tuesday, November 5th, is the 100-year centennial or 100-year anniversary of Maine ratifying the 19th Amendment. I talk about it in my book. It was a big deal. They almost didn't get it done. In the end, Florence and Alice Paul had to get these leaders of the Maine Federation of Labor into a room at the Capitol and get them to recant on this broadside they put out to the newspapers calling on the legislature to vote down the ratification. And they get it through the Senate. It was about 25-5, I think, but in the House they won by only 4 votes. So if it hadn't been for that last minute push by Florence and Alice Paul, they might not have ratified. But Maine becomes the 19th state to ratify the 19th Amendment in November of 1919. So there they are at the signing ceremony, and there's Florence standing behind Carl Milliken, the governor, and this is Grace Hill, who is also her partner in crime in the National Women's Party. And these are all MISA members. This is Catherine Reed Ballantyne, who was the daughter of Czar Reed, Thomas Reed, the Speaker of the U.S. House. And this is Ann Pattengull, I think, and that's Ann Gannett, and I'm blanking on her name. But they, in Pattengull maybe? Anyway, you can see here that he's using a purple, white, and gold quill to sign the ratification. That was a quill that the National Women's Party had made and passed around from state to state to be used in these signing ceremonies. So in using it, I think he's clearly indicating who he thinks was responsible for the victory. And afterward, he gave to all the women souvenir pens, but everybody else got an ordinary steel one, and Florence got a gold-handled pen. So I think that was kind of in a nod to her outlaw ways, perhaps. So here they are on State Street in Portland. There's Florence. Votes for Women a Success, it says. And this is the language of the 19th Amendment. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very simple statement. It took 72 years for this. If you count just back from 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, it took 72 years for this language to become part of our U.S. Constitution. Obviously, if you count back from the start of the country, which many people do, it was a lot longer than that. It wasn't the end. It was the end of the beginning, because there were so many other rights that women had to campaign for, and there were challenges right away. There were challenges to the ratification that went to the Maine Supreme Court. There were challenges to, okay, well, they have the right to vote, but can they serve in office? Can they be elected? And that went to the Maine Supreme Court. So right away there were challenges. So I think it's important to understand that the only constitutionally protected right that women have is the right to vote. Every other right that we've won has come through either legislative action, statutes, regulations, sometimes court opinions or rulings, but our rights are not guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution or in the Maine state constitution. So just be thinking about that. So not everybody knows this history, but the National American Women's Suffrage Association becomes the League of Women Voters. The National Women's Party doesn't have to change its name, it just continues under that name. And in 1923 submits the Equal Rights Amendment to the Congress. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Looks very similar to the 19th Amendment. As you may know, it took from 1923 to 1972 for Congress to finally pass this. And Congress gave them 7 years to get it ratified. They had 38 states then they had to get to persuade to ratify it, and they didn't get it done. They had to come back to Congress after 7 years and say, we need more time. Congress gave them 3 more years, but they still couldn't get it done. So they were 3 states short. Maine was one of the states to ratify. We did it in 1974, but this is sort of now back as a live option. And originally they thought they were going to have to give up and start over, but then just in the last couple of years, 2 other states have ratified. So Nevada and Illinois. So we're waiting on the last state and to see what will happen in Congress when that happens. So back to Florence here. This is one of her paintings that she did later in life. This is on Monhegan. She liked to go up there to paint. Here's another one. And here she is with her middle son, Robert Treat, and they called him Bobo, and later, a few years before she died. So, if I knew her now, I would think that she was a pretty amazing woman, but against the backdrop of her own time and place, I think she was quite remarkable. I learned so much about, when I was researching her, I learned so much from her. One of the things I took away from that was she encouraged me to be successful and to pursue success in a lot of different spheres. And by her example, really encouraged us to do that. And she reminds me always that the work I do is women's work because I choose to set my hand to it, not because anybody else defines it that way for me. So there she is in later life, and she died in 1945. The governor spoke at her funeral. She was a well-known personality at that time. She became a really big peace activist after suffrage was won, so she went on to lots of other things as well. But I'll looking at the clock, I'll stop here and see if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Yes, I was reading an article heard a little clip on the news in the last couple of weeks, and it talked about there was a lot more to the suffrage movement than just voting. And by that I mean they said that women really couldn't file for divorce, they didn't have property rights. If I'm not mistaken, it was something to the effect they couldn't open up their own bank account without the husband's name being put on it. Are you familiar with any of these other issues that we don't seem to hear much about? You know, it seems that it's just the right to vote, but there was a number of other issues that women were struggling to get.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in 1848, at the Seneca Falls, New York conference or convention that's a sort of big, a lot of people sort of trace the organized effort to win voting rights for women back to 1848. At that time, women had all the rights of the cattle in the barn, or not even. I mean, they, as you said, they didn't have rights to their children, they couldn't divorce, they had very limited opportunities for work, there was no equal pay for equal work. So systematically, while they were pursuing suffrage, the activists tried to go after those rights as well. But even after suffrage was won, I mean, it wasn't until the 1970s that the Supreme Court finally ruled that states had to give women an equal opportunity to serve on juries, for example, with men. Now, some states had done it, some hadn't, but in a lot of states, the judge could decide whether a woman could hear a case or not, and if it was too racy, the judge would say no. And in other states, you had to go down and file an application at the courthouse asking to be put on a jury. And so if you could think about a domestic violence case, you would want women on your jury, I would think, if you were going after your husband or for alimony or things like that. So certainly custody, Maine finally, the legislature here in the late 19th century does restore or does give some custody rights to women. But it's also true that it wasn't until 1974, I think, 72 or 4, that the Congress said that women had to be extended credit on an equal basis to men. And I've talked to many women, and maybe there are some in the audience here today, who had the experience where they couldn't buy a house without a cosigner, a male cosigner. They couldn't get a credit card. If they had credit and they married their husband and subsequently divorced him, all their credit went to their husband. They had to reestablish credit on their own. Things like that. It wasn't until the 1980s that the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to sexually harass women at the work site. And the case that they brought to the Supreme Court was an African American woman who had been raped repeatedly by her boss over many years. And so you can see that those fights really extended for decades past when suffrage was won. So yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
One of the things I found most interesting in my genealogy research was when a woman married, she took on the citizenship of her husband.
Yeah.
So if an American woman born in Baltimore married somebody from Canada, she became Canadian.
Right.
If he died, she did not become American again. She had to file for naturalization to become an American once again because her citizenship had shifted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like crazy to me.
I did a cross-country road trip in 2015 that was retracing a 1915 road trip that these suffrage activists took 100 years before. And I stopped I researched their entire route, and I stopped in Nevada on the way across. And this woman there told me that her husband was from Kentucky, and they'd gone to live in Nevada. He was in the Air Force. And when she went to register to vote, which, I mean, this was in the 60s, I think, she was certainly entitled to do, they told her, no, you have to vote in the state that your husband's parents are from, or some craziness like that. And fortunately, she had this stuff to make a fuss about it. In the end, they granted her a special exception. I mean, it was ridiculous. Yeah, and women, I mean, I have a friend who's 85 now, and she was married, she had 5 kids, and after her 5th kid was born, she and her husband separated, and she wanted to have her tubes tied so that she could date, and this was the 60s, she could be active again. And she was told when she went to the hospital to have the procedure done that the surgeon wouldn't do it unless her husband signed off on it. And they were legally separated on their way to divorce, and she just lost it. And fortunately, her doctor came to bat for her and said, no, we're not going to do that. And but that was pretty standard. Yeah.
I just want to say that I read your book. It's incredibly interesting. And it's very detailed, but I couldn't put it down. It's so very interesting.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, as I told my book club, it's not the worst book I've ever made you read. Yeah.
Why did the women out west have the right to vote? And was it just municipal elections, state elections? Could they vote in federal? I think you mentioned early on that women west of the Mississippi in a lot of states, or a large number, could vote. Why did they have the right? Any idea?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of hypotheses, and one is that they just, the East Coast was settled by Europeans and really was under British common law, so same very conservative law framework in the East, and whereas in the West, once the people who went west, the pioneers, they had a hard life out there. Women had to work on the farms, they had to take care of the kids, and they were really just equal partners with their husbands. The rules that applied to what they could and couldn't do by sort of snobby society didn't apply out west. And so the Western, in the West, they were much more likely to grant women suffrage. And the other practical reality was that in Wyoming, there were something like 7 men to every woman. So if you wanted a woman to come west, offering her voting rights might be a little bit of an enticement. So, I don't know. Could be multiple factors. So I'm a member of the steering committee of the Maine Suffrage Centennial Collaborative, and so we've adopted the slogan of hard won, not done. We're still seeing efforts to suppress people's voting rights all over the country, not so much in Maine, but a little bit. There's been efforts to, for college students and things like that. So keep that in mind. I mean, I think this is an evolving thing, and we're certainly seeing efforts to roll back rights that women have taken for granted to some degree, especially abortion rights, and access to birth control. I mean, around the time that my great-grandmother was active in suffrage, it was illegal. It was illegal to talk about birth control in public. And women could, people could be arrested for doing so, and were. And you couldn't send birth control information through the mail either, under the Comstock laws. And so, and even into the 70s, it was often the case that women couldn't get access to birth control unless they could prove they were married. So now we're seeing efforts by the Republican administration in Washington to remove birth control from, when they start repealing and replacing Obamacare, you often see that birth control is sort of removed from the list of things that are required for insurance companies to cover, and certainly access to abortion rights. And regardless of how you feel about abortion, the best way to make sure there's not an unwanted pregnancy is to provide birth control. So I mean, it's really quite scary to see the number of states nationally that are enacting greater and greater restrictions on access to abortions. And there was this case just the other day, just last week, that this was in Missouri, that their public health leader there was actually tracking women's menstrual cycles. I saw something in Virginia just this morning. I'm pretty sure it was not fictional, or fake news, but they were, one legislator in Virginia was proposing that women have ankle bracelets to verify that they don't go someplace and have an abortion. So it's time to be a little scared if you're a woman, or if you have great, granddaughters or daughters. So just keep that in mind. And I just wanted to share this this quote from Alice Paul: "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." So I think that's good for us to remember as we look at ways to suppress voting rights and especially minorities' voting rights and the rights of women generally. There are options for action. The League of Women Voters in this state especially is really energized. They've hired a new executive director, a young woman who's doing great work for them, and there's a lot of energy there. Planned Parenthood, is really beleaguered. Maine is in pretty in a good place here, but nationally it's really, under threat. I mentioned that Maine did ratify the 19th Amendment, but after it failed to be ratified nationally, activists decided to try and insert the same language into state constitutions. And so other states around the country have done this, not everyone, but many. But Maine has never done this. So every year, the legislature, this bill gets introduced into the legislature. This year is LD 433, and it was voted down on party lines. All the Republicans voted against it. All the Democrats voted for it. And I don't understand why equal rights for women is a partisan issue in this day and age. It just seems crazy to me. But if you have a Republican member of the House, it passed in the Senate. It was fine in the Senate, but they needed 2/3 majority in both houses. And it was 6 or 7 votes short in the House. So if you have a Republican member of the House, talk to that person about LD 433. It'll be back in front of the legislature this year, I think.
What is the because there was an article about this the other day, I believe in Maine Women Magazine, I haven't read it yet. What is it though, what is exactly the LD 433? Is it changing the language?
It's introducing new language into the state constitution that guarantees equality, no matter, irrespective of sex. I can't remember the exact, language of the legislation, but that's basically, it's just saying you can't discriminate against people on the basis of sex. And I suspect that some of the pushback against it is because of some people's discomfort around, transgender people and that kind of thing these days. But I mean, it's pretty clear, and it basically it can have the same benefits for men. For example, increasingly men are being able to stay home on paternity leave, and there have been some cases just in this last year where men are denied paternity leave for which they're legally eligible, and they've had to take it to court. So it's not just equal rights for women, it's really equal, preventing or prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex. So it's good for men as well as women, and it went down on party lines. I think we're done. Thank you. The lights stay on.